Okay, so this account. Я, блядь, не мог, блядь, сука. Бля. 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 Shame. Oh god, let's do it again. Just...
Careful. Leave it to me. Let's make this quick. Concentrate.
Time for an appetizer. Rest should bring you through.
An opening. Allow me, Fufu. Leave it to me. Let's make this quick.
Let me see what you're made of. The enemy's up to something.
Inadequate. Swift yet still. Release. Clarity and impurity cycle. Take this. Don't hesitate. Disappointing. Evil shall be purged. Yeah!
Okay, I asked 20 game developers about stopping games by Carolina HZ Art. Carolina Hazard. Okay, sure. By the way, she seems like a character, a person that I watched previously, but how? However, oh, Accursed Farms did comment here, so I suppose he also commented on the Moon channel. Moon channel. I don't want to watch it, I want to see what Stop Killing Games responded. I was asked to comment on this. I hate saying this, but I feel like the bulk of your analysis is looking at directions SKG isn't going. Some bullet points. You're correct, we're not attempting the hard way whatsoever. We're not seeking full ownership, only the ability to retain whatever limited rights the publishers sold to consumer in order to pay the plays the game itself. What we're judging is terms like can terminate at any time for any reason, present and most online only game users. The Commission has stated that terms like that may already be a violation of directive, which is supposed to protect consumers against terms and contracts. It's still unsettled. The problem is remedies are listed under Directive EU, which are based on the duration of the contract, but are often announced under duration. This is currently a legal gray zone. Compare the government standard on Uber when it's out, when the win was, the EU and member countries kind of have to address what the policy will be. The way I see it is that the EU confirms customer protections and apply towards customers starting video games of again protections. I'm not sure if there's a much in between area. We're also not accepting the easy way, since the industry as a whole has been very clear it has no interest in changing practices whatsoever, minus Ubisoft modifying two games. It's not a matter of us being for this or against this, but rather I don't think this option even exists for us. What we're doing is more like a variant of your missing way, with a heavy focus on directive by focusing on possible conflicts of game users with existing consoles. We might be able to sidestep IP law entirely, since we're not specifying how publishers don't remove rights. They have already sold to the customer, just so they don't violate additional consumer rights in the process of protecting their IP. We're not asking for specific IP property, we're saying publishers can't be selling games under terms and violate consumer law, and in doing so could largely solve the problem of games being destroyed. The laws mentioned in the annex aren't overly important. That's more about getting our foot in the door to demonstrate that the EU has to look into the issue in the first place. What matters more in the arguments which will be presented to the new Commission in Brussels. Laws regarding software digital goods are unlikely to give consumer and protections in the EU. The EU waited in on the appeal of USCQ Chaucer versus Valve, stating games are considered more than just software to all the copyright content they contain. Thus, regular console laws might not apply to them. I forget the details, but it's also along these lines. I just agree in us already winning, nothing is settled yet, but we have basically maximized our chances on this, minus someone going behind the scenes stuff. And the Mooney responded to this with where is the response? Hey Ross, I'm really honored that you took the time to comment on the video. There's no need to be apologetic. The objective of this video was to bring a few of those points into the discussion. I'm grateful to have the opportunity to discuss despite the strangeness of the forum. One of you are already talking to the Commission, then you're further along the timeline than I anticipated. It's great news, but I do think that the unfairness of the contracts cannot be removed from the concept of licensure. The unfairness is derived from the power of the license, which touches upon the subject of ownership and the power imbued in the license. Okay, I'm not. Oh god, it's even more addendum for boring law people, just for the reference of people who actually do care about the legal aspects of the case. The Supreme Court in UFC v. SWAT specifically even stated that used soft does not apply to computer programs, precisely because video games are different from mere software, which is to say the court held that video games should be subject to more publisher control, not less, by merit of being video games. Okay, yes, and more responses, yeah. Okay, in response to the comments, oh god, it is indeed not really useful forum. Oh, Rise again of Dog Walker. What? He rised again? Never mind, I'm gonna continue watching the video of Coronel Hazard. if that's how you pronounce it.
I asked 20 game developers about the Stop Killing Games initiative to get actual game developer perspectives on the petition, how realistic or not the suggestions within it are, and just the general sense of things that they do or don't like about it. Now, I am covering this a bit late because, like, 2 days after I did these interviews, there was a whole new wave of drama surrounding the topic, and I just very much wanted to avoid having any part of that. But I will give you some context. So, before we get into what the devs had to say, in case you've somehow never heard of this at all, and you're currently just extremely confused about what I'm talking about, in the creator's own words, Stop Killing Games is a consumer movement started to challenge the legality of publishers destroying video games that they have sold to customers. The website continues, an increasing number of video games is sold effectively as goods with no stated expiration date, but designed to be completely unplayable as soon as support from the publisher ends. This practice is a form of planned obsolescence and is not only detrimental to customers, but makes preservation effectively impossible. Furthermore, the legality of this practice is largely untested in many countries. Basically, the goal is to prevent publishers from being able to take video games that people have bought and paid for offline, making them unplayable. The creators are asking for a version of any game that you have bought to still be playable even after the publisher stops supporting it. The movement's EU petition amassed 1,400,000 signatures. The UK petition got almost 200,000 signatures. Because of the crazy volume of signatures, various governing bodies do have to consider the issue for debate, and according to the Stop Killing Games website, the movement has successfully escalated complaints on this problem to consumer agencies in France, Germany, and Australia, and have brought forth petitions for new law on this problem to various countries. They said, as of 2025, most consumer action on this matter has concluded, and we are waiting decisions on it from several governments. But they have been a bunch of questions about how feasible any of this is, and a whole internet saga, the aforementioned drama with a popular streamer known as Pirate Software, very heavily criticizing the movement and then receiving a lot of backlash for doing so.
I've been called a corporate plant, degenerate, narcissist, nepo baby, and many other names, and they attack all the accomplishments of my life despite physical evidence to prove to the contrary. And they also went after every job I ever held, trying to say that I never worked them, or if I did work them, that I never deserved them. So I'm going to be honest with you. I hope that your initiative gets everything you asked for, but nothing you wanted.
I also personally don't really have a lot of opinions of my own to share of this of any value, really, which is why I asked a bunch of other game devs about it. I asked people with varying degrees of experience, AAA, indie, multiplayer, single player, MMOs, hero shooters, you name it. I really tried to get as much broad spectrum information as possible, and because of that, I find it like really especially interesting where the answers overlap significantly. But yes, worth noting, almost nothing I'm about to say is my opinion, except for this word from our sponsor. So we'll get to the answer. Okay, so there are two things that the developers that I asked about Stop Killing Games agreed on almost unanimously. The first, game devs would really like it if their games were playable forever. They would love it if the thing that they worked on was prevented from disappearing because some publisher decided to shut it down. One developer said that 99% of the games that they've worked on in their career are no longer available or playable, which is insane. Like, that's so much creative labor to just have disappear, and the creator doesn't even have to be told about it. And on that note, I'm going to start this with an important quote from Emma Kidwell, an award-winning game dev currently working at Firaxis. She said, and pretty much every single person that I spoke to echoed some version of this, game developers love making games. We love playing games, and nothing breaks our hearts like corporate greed and profits killing our hard work and a player's enjoyment of it. I promise you, we aren't the ones behind any long-lasting awful decisions being made. We don't want it either. We're on your side. We want to make things you'll buy and keep until we all turn to dust. Which, woo! Go Emma! Thank you. Obviously, if you're not new to my channel, you'll have heard me rant many times about how game devs and publishers are two very different things, but it does feel like it's worth pointing out and repeating over and over and over again, because far too many people still equate the two. And with that, virtually all of the developers wanted the initiative to succeed. Literally only one person was strongly against it, and even that was because of the specific technicalities of the games that their studio is making. So I ask that you remember this regarding everything I'm about to tell you. It wouldn't be fair for me to include quotes that focus on some of the complications or like criticisms or just questions without really highlighting these developers were overwhelmingly in support of Stop Killing Games and hope that it succeeds in some form. Which, the second unanimous thing, everyone agreed that this is extremely complicated and, as exists with many facets of game dev, way harder than most people seem to think, outside of a few small circumstances. Even the people who were most enthusiastically loud about their support, expressing frustrations that people across the internet were excessively simplifying things. Not the creator of the initiative himself, I do want to be clear about that, but people in surrounding conversations were making things sound way easier than they actually are. So, let's get into that. I directly asked a group of devs how difficult they thought it would be to implement an ability to just allow players to continue playing an online game after a studio has taken servers offline, and the answers amounted to depends on the game and how much of the game needs to be playable, and then ranged from easy for this type of game and impossible for this type of game. It was a spectrum. There's just a ton of variability. Thankfully, Stop Killing Games is not retroactive. They are not asking devs to update existing games because honestly, that would actually genuinely probably crash the entire industry. That's not even an exaggeration. Like in some cases, it would straight up be impossible, functionally, technically impossible. In the others, it would be so expensive that everything would burn down. But for new games, as in games that are not already in development, like it's things that would be starting development post-petition, most devs agreed that it was actually fairly simple as long as they knew ahead of time. Here is an exact quote from one of these devs. This is from Maxwell Cones, who is a level designer and Unity generalist at Team Nemo. He said, "It would be as simple as just setting up private server hosting from the get-go. It's not necessarily a free add-in, it would take some time and testing, but if we think about it in terms of regular testing, we already have a responsibility to ensure that we are selling a game that reasonably functions, doesn't break your computer or console, and doesn't introduce any new security risks to your computer. I think those are already fair expectations a consumer should have of a product they buy, so while it may be a not insignificant amount of extra work, it's not unprecedented, and it's not exponentially any harder than the other responsibilities I've mentioned." Consensus is yeah, as long as you develop with the thing in mind to begin with, it's doable. This applies to virtually every facet of game development. To be clear, as long as you are making something with this stuff in mind from the beginning, this is definitely really important in terms of video game accessibility, it's much, much, much easier to do. Now, I also wanted to include this example from Zach Johnson, a senior software engineer who has worked on a number of Blizzard games, just because I thought the specifics were really interesting. He said, "For Warcraft 3 Reforged and Diablo 2 Resurrected, we had command line arguments we could provide to internal builds that could bypass online authentication, authorization, and other facets of DRM. This would allow the player to continue playing all offline functionality, such as custom games in Warcraft 3 Reforged or single-player characters in Diablo 2 Resurrected. It would take a single developer less than a week to change the code to make that the default behavior, get QA to test the change and ensure the game works otherwise, and release it to players as a final end-of-life build. And a week is a conservative estimate, but everything in game dev takes 3 times longer than we think." MMOs and mobile games are sort of an exception to this, interestingly enough, and mobile games specifically feel like a very under-discussed part of this whole thing. Mobile games have traditionally just been allowed to delist themselves anytime they like Flappy Bird, for example, famously being pulled down after like tremendous, insane success because the creator felt guilty about how addictive it was and was concerned about overusage. This was in a period of time where he was making, reportedly, $50,000 per day from that game, by the way, even though it was a free game. But basically, this can be a core design issue for mobile games and MMOs. Like, games that are dependent on consistent updates and microtransactions as part of their, like, design ethos, like gacha games, become a completely different game if you take them offline. John Ryan, who is a senior narrative designer who's worked for multiple AAA studios, used a game called Lily's Garden as an example, saying, "What does the gameplay experience look like when you allow people to continue playing a game that is designed with online functionality in mind, but let them play it offline?" You'd have to imagine what the gameplay experience would be online versus offline from the very genesis of the game. Can you have the same experience? How would it be built? Would you be making 2 games at that point? It could basically make it more difficult to design these games at all, depending on what the legislation would actually be asking for. There's also a whole slew of complications with the way that the App Store functions, like what is qualified as a game on the App Store. That's not even that simple. Do games that are more akin to experiences count? Who knows? There are a few more highly specific concerns. A big one is external dependency. Studios that use third-party services that must be paid for. Mike Witherick, I hope I'm pronouncing your name right, Mike, the chief technical officer at MegaFresh Interactive, said, "Many studios use third-party services such as PlayFab to provide back-end services for their game. Building a game that is dependent on third-party services like this means that it is literally impossible to operate unless someone is paying for the services." Similarly, Yvonne Leon, who is a senior AI/gameplay programmer, said, "Something that I have seen surprisingly repeated many times is the concept of just distributing binaries to keep the game accessible when in reality only a few companies can afford that. Most games nowadays, even those developed with in-house engines, rely on third-party tools, Fmod, Havok, SpeedTree, for different goals. When you get one of those licenses to use their libraries in your project, that license does not include the right to distribute that code, which, among many more things, is what comes in said binaries. Stop Killing Games is not asking for studios to pay for servers or third-party services indefinitely. For the record, that is not an ask at all, not even a little bit, but as Mike is saying, if your game just straight up doesn't function without a particular third-party tool, that has to be paid for on an ongoing basis, and in that case, the legislation would sort of force you to keep paying, which is not sustainable for almost any studio, certainly not any indie studio. There were two other devs who shared similar sentiments that Stop Killing Games would likely prevent them from using certain third-party services that they currently use quite often, because their games are built knowing that they can rely on those and pay for them for as long as the game is profitable, aka people are still buying it and playing it. I guess the solution would be for all developers to just stop using any of these third-party services for any new games in development, which is not impossible, but also, you know, a noteworthy consideration. This would have a pretty tremendous impact on the industry on many scales, and it's a big hurdle for teams who are used to developing with this technology in mind. They might have to learn a whole new skill set, which takes time, which actively costs development money. One developer who asked to remain anonymous explicitly told me that being unable to use these third-party tools or companies would likely shut down some studios and could otherwise make funding much more difficult for multiplayer indie games due to potential added development costs for teams who just don't already have the experience with this kind of thing. Like, it is an added cost because they don't have experience with other tools. RuneScape was a really interesting example in the like damages due to dependencies sort of category. Fred Horgan, a senior technical director currently at Astrid Entertainment, also worked on RuneScape, which is an MMO that runs entirely on in-house tech. Again, he also noted that the initiative is not retroactive, but I felt like this tidbit was worth sharing regarding design complications specifically. It's just really interesting. He said of RuneScape, its heavy use of bespoke tech designed specifically to run RuneScape in a known environment means getting it to run outside of this environment could be extremely complicated. For an existing game like RuneScape, this isn't an issue. However, it means that Jagex's in-house engine may become unsuitable for future projects purely because of assumptions made way before the initiative existed. Basically meaning that this studio and many others might have to make a whole new engine for any future games because their previous ones were not built with this initiative in mind, or even really considered because they can't see the future. But even in instances where it seemed like it was actually like functionally, technically, fairly, again, simple to allow online games to remain playable without needing ongoing developer or publisher support, there were just a ton of questions about which version of things should or should not exist, and just like how complicated that might be legally. These questions were not directed at the creator of Stop Killing Games, again, to be clear, who may have their own answers. The questions were much more focused about how it would actually look in any governmental or legal proceedings. Like, what are the courts actually going to be asking game devs for? Like, if there is an update for League or Apex or Valorant or Overwatch or whatever else, would that prevent it from being retroactive? Most of those games aren't set up to be hostable for individual players, making that really difficult. And about games like these, a systems designer who worked at a AAA studio who was asked to remain anonymous asked, how on earth do you word that legally in a way that doesn't allow publishers to find loopholes and exploits? Which I actually think is a really great point. They continued, League of Legends isn't affected since it came out before the bill was passed. Publishers know that, and my concern is that we'll just start seeing more games turned into live services, kind of like how Call of Duty does it. A series like Assassin's Creed could become a single ongoing platform where new entries are just paid updates or DLC instead of full new games. It seems like it would be a fairly easy way for really big juggernaut studios to get around the new rules, but it feels like a loss for players, especially with how tired people already are of live service games and juggling a bunch of different launches. Which, quick side note, a lot of these developers shared speculative concerns about some of the ways that publishers might respond. 3 separate devs said that they expected that publishers would very likely massively increase everybody's favorite thing, microtransactions, specifically in things like sports games, which would sort of no longer be able to release annually to try to recoup any potential revenue loss or use it as an excuse to increase them. And they were against this, to be clear. This is the part where I tap the sign. Game developers and publishers are different, and devs are very much on the public side regarding disliking publishers' shitty, greedy practices, even if they are forced to implement some of them. Okay? Anyway, sorry, back to the what version of this game has to exist and how much of it needs to be playable questions that are hard to avoid talking about when talking about MMOs. One developer brought up Wrath of the Lich King as an example. Blizzard has technically killed that version of the game, so how do you differentiate between versions which can or cannot be like killed, legally speaking. These things will have to find explicit legal definitions, and that's just going to be really hard. On this, Kevin O'Brien, who is a senior QA manager at Theorycraft Games, asked, if it's just the core gameplay and none of the thrills, then it might not be that bad for a game like League of Legends or Valorant to be playable without the platform. The developer could release the game on a client-specific version and a matching game server with some basic instructions on how to run the game server. Or maybe it needs to be doable for a normal consumer to get it running, in which case the bar would be way higher. Another challenge would be that the game server expects to receive certain information from the platform. Who are the players? Which character did they select to play? Which cosmetics are they using? Which team are they on, etc. I expect the server would just fail to function until you either modify that code or provide it the information it's looking for. Which, yeah, for things like this, there are basically a lot of questions about, like, what level of technical understanding or know-how is expected to be expected from players. Like, does a casual console gamer need to easily be able to run an MMO that no longer has publisher server support without any technical knowledge? Like someone who has never set up a custom server in their life, do they need to be able to know how to do this? How easy does it have to be? Which I guess ties into the next point. There were some public criticisms about the petition being way too vague, and while I suspect that that's where a lot of the devs' questions are inherently coming from,
That's me!
many of the devs that I interviewed said that they felt that it was worded as well as it possibly could be, considering the complexity of the ask. One developer said, I feel like the language in the petition can't possibly be specific enough to capture all of the nuance of different technologies at play. Which is fair. It's sort of impossible to be hyper-specific about an industry that just has so much variability. And it's not on Stop Killing Games as an initiative to figure out all the answers or come up with all of the definitions. Like, they haven't presented a technical document. That is on the legislating bodies, like I keep saying. And yeah, they're certainly just in for a real tough time regarding MMOs and live service games specifically. More than one developer, again, who was still actually supportive of the initiative overall, believed it was likely to fail to get through Parliament entirely just because it's so complicated, and government officials certainly aren't going to know anything about the complexities of video game infrastructure, which is a valid cause for concern. And one very common just outright criticism, maybe the only one that game devs shared of Stop Killing Games that doesn't fit in the, like, I just have a lot of questions about this category, was part of the website's FAQ specifically. There is a question that reads, wouldn't this be a security risk for video game companies? And the FAQ states, not at all. In asking for a game to be operable, we're not demanding internal code and documentation, just a functional copy of the game. It would be no more of a security risk than selling the game in the first place. Numerous developers did not agree with this one, and I think part of that is tied into a public misunderstanding of technical terms like security, like what security means in context of video games or software. Most people think hacking or vulnerabilities protecting against unauthorized access. And while that is part of it, there were some concerns, basically because it's overall much bigger than that. Zach Johnson, who we heard from a little bit earlier, said, this initiative is absolutely a security risk for companies. A contrived example, someone runs a Halo 2 server that kicks all players who join that don't have slurs in their usernames. PC Gamer writes an article associating Halo 2 with servers that contain slurs. The mother of a gamer reads this article in passing and assumes Microsoft is enabling this behavior rather than being unable to stop it due to players running their own standalone servers. He continued, "I'm not saying this is how I want things to be. I want the Stop Killing Games initiative to succeed. There are some legitimate security concerns that companies will have in regards to allowing their intellectual property to exist outside of their immediate purview. The job description of what we call Chief Information Security Officer, the CISO, should help to clarify just how much shit these guys are thinking about in terms of security." Basically, it also encompasses brand risks, but there are actually also some positives that you may not have expected. Multiple developers mention that if this passes, publishers will effectively be forced to financially support some of their ideas, particularly the kinds of things that are routinely rejected. Matthew, a developer from Ubisoft, said, "I remember working on a game where user passwords and IPs were stored in a simple database without any kind of encryption. Since RGPD, which is a separate legislation, passed, when bosses asked to do that sort of things, us devs can say that's illegal and force our bosses to give us time to do things properly. If this initiative succeeds, our offline mode ideas will not stay on the design whiteboard, our bosses will have to let us implement them." I can imagine that's especially nice for some
Only the brave will win. That's me!
somebody who works at Ubisoft. Like, that rules. And to continue on the positives, Maxwell Kunz, who was mentioned earlier, said, "In some cases, it may make development time quicker. Right now, there are some games that are online only, even during their single-player experiences. Stop Killing Games would discourage that kind of functionality, so if the publisher decides that it no longer makes the online-only single-player functionality worth it, suddenly that's a bit less work that needs to be added towards that single-player content. But let's be real, there are scarcely any good reasons to make a single-player game require the internet." And he's totally right. I don't know if there are any good reasons. Like, do you remember when you just used to put a cartridge in a console and a game room? You used to just like insert a disc and play a video game, and now you have to download everything on top of putting a disc in. Like, I can't believe what they've taken from us. It's insane. On that note, when I asked about game preservation in general, almost everybody agreed that the current state just sucks ass. And they're really glad that someone's making an effort to fix the ass suckiness. Admittedly, a few of them just didn't care that much about game preservation, especially like considering the tremendous volume of video games that exist, which, fair enough, to each their own. Now, I could keep going. I could make this video an hour long. Like, every single one of these developers gave me incredibly detailed answers, and I am so thankful for their time. Like, several apologized for giving me such lengthy responses, which I think is how you know that they care, and they really do. Again, my takeaway from this is that literally all devs dislike what publishers are doing insofar as like taking games offline or preventing games from being playable, including the games that they personally play. It sucks. It's not fair for customers. It's bad. It should be changed. But I do also get the impression that there are just some frustrations regarding Stop Killing Games, more so the broader conversation on the internet, overly simplifying how this would work. It is complicated. It's expected to be very complicated in court. As said, some people think it could be impossible, or at least many of the questions raised here will be answered throughout a very lengthy process by design. But that said, virtually everyone is glad that someone is trying to make a difference. Like I said, like, no one wants things the way that they are, it's just that the solution is complicated. I think that Freb Horgan put it very well when they said, "The initiative is already fairly hefty in what it's trying to achieve. If anything, I think the wide net it's trying to cast may end up causing a lot of headaches when it comes to actual legal discussions. I genuinely hope that we at least get some sort of conversation started around the topic of terminating live games and the implications it has on preservation as a whole. Even if nothing tangible comes directly from the initiative itself, it will hopefully open some doors that we can take in the future to help game preservation in some way."
What brings you here?
My
this
channel is
time?
sponsored by Raycon, which means we will have an ad from them somewhere in the middle of today's video. Also, I did not know this when I was recording this, but my camera had some frame rate drops. I tried to cover most of it with other footage, but if you occasionally see what looks like a bunch of jump cuts, it is actually just my webcam dropping frames. Sorry about that.
We're a grassroots campaigning movement. We're like a rapid response, hit squad.
I've sat down to make this video like 4 separate times now, and every single time that I do, I have to then re-record it because the story keeps updating. So at this point, we're just gonna acknowledge it's a developing story, things may change. Which, related, because of some of the subject material, I normally probably would not have had a sponsor in a video like this, but because of the date, I contractually have to. I do not have a choice. So I decided to use some of that revenue to pay some of the journalists who've had some of their work taken down for even talking about what we're going to be talking about today, because apparently that's a thing that's happening. Also do feel like I need to be a little cautious talking about this on YouTube myself, so I'm going to report on this as accurately as possible while also recognizing that I might have to avoid saying certain words. On July 11, an Australian organization called Collective Shout, which, come on, you guys. Why did it have to be Australia? They published an open letter directed at the CEO of PayPal, the CEO of MasterCard, the CEO of Visa, the CEO of PaySafe Limited, the interim CEO of Discover, asking them to cease operations on platforms Steam and itch.io, specifically referencing games with explicit sexual content. They used a game called No Mercy to spearhead this movement, and that game, which has been taken down seemingly by the developer themselves, is literally non-consent simulator. Like, that is what that game is /was. The dev has a statement on their profile, but I looked up gameplay and it's called No Mercy for a reason. The letter claims the organization found many games on Steam that include the same or similar themes and ends with, "We request that you demonstrate corporate responsibility and immediately cease processing payments on Steam and itch.io and any other platforms hosting similar games." Basically, because they claim to have found games including a particular type of content, and they kind of can't have even found No Mercy organically because it already wasn't available in Australia.
Nice argument, Senator. Why don't you back it up with a source?
My source is that I made it the fuck up.
They've asked international credit card companies to stop processing payments on all video games on Steam everywhere. Excuse me? And it's kind of working. On July 16, Steam added a new rule that would disallow games that violated the rules and standards set by payment processing card networks or internet network providers. They also removed a series of games containing a particular kind of content. Not long after, games that use the NSFW tag on itch.io, a Steam-like platform largely used by indie developers to self-publish their own games, no longer appeared in search results. This includes games that have absolutely nothing to do with explicit sexual content or anything related to consent. Wired highlighted one game called Consume Me, which is about a teenager navigating her relationship with her own body and diet culture. Nothing sexual about it. It's hard for me to get through this without watching the stream. But the game developers were not warned ahead of time, and itch.io was prompted to make a statement. It reads, "We have de-indexed all adult NSFW content from our browse and search pages. We understand this action is sudden and disruptive, and we are truly sorry for the frustration and confusion caused by this change. Recently, we came under scrutiny from payment processors regarding the nature of some content posted on itch.io. Due to a game titled No Mercy, which was temporarily available in itch.io before being banned back in April, the organization Collective Shout launched a campaign against Steam and itch.io directing concerns to our payment processors about the nature of certain content found on both platforms. Our ability to process payments is critical for every creator on our platform. To ensure that we can continue to operate and provide a marketplace for all developers, we must prioritize our relationship with our payment partners and take immediate steps towards compliance." While I think the situation sucks a lot, I don't actually blame itch here. They're a small team. The site allows anyone to post really anything, where Steam, comparatively, actually requires approval for any pages before publication. A few days later, itch.io started relisting any games that had the NSFW tag but were available for free, because naturally, if you can't pay for them, the credit card companies are not upset about them. I do actually feel similarly about what Valve has done in terms of the selective nature of the games that they took down. I don't feel like either of these companies are actually to blame for what has happened. They straight up do not have a choice. This is like enforced blanket censorship coming from an organization that we will get to. MasterCard, however, has come out and claimed that they haven't changed shit. They issued a company statement titled Clarifying Recent Headlines on Gaming Content, which says, MasterCard has not valued any game or required restrictions of any activity on game creators' sites and platforms, contrary to media reports and allegations. Our payment network follows standards based on the rule of law. Put simply, we allow all lawful purchases on our network. At the same time, we require merchants to have appropriate controls to ensure MasterCard cards cannot be used for unlawful purchases, including illegal adult content. Valve, however, issued a response to that response in a statement to Kotaku. They said, MasterCard did not communicate with Valve directly, despite our request to do so. MasterCard communicated with payment processors and their acquiring banks. Payment processors communicated this with Valve, and we replied by outlining Steam's policy since 2018 of attempting to distribute games that are legal for distribution. Payment processors rejected this and specifically cited MasterCard's Rule 5.12.7 and risk to the MasterCard brand. I looked it up, and Rule 5.12.7 for reference says the sale of a product or service including an image which is patently offensive and lacks serious artistic value, such as, by way of example and not limitation, images of non-consensual sexual behavior, sexual exploitation of a minor, non-consensual mutilation of a person or body part, and bestiality, or any other material that the corporation deems unacceptable to sell in connection with a mark. So basically it means anything. Of course, a lot of the games suffering absolutely do not fit those descriptions. To put itch into perspective for people who may not be familiar with this platform, basically every small-scale indie dev is publishing their game on itch.io. It is a place where they can find a market, even for a game they know is very niche or won't appeal to a lot of people. Weird little games made at game jams, student games, things that are much more akin to like artistic expression than video games, and deeply personal, very specific experiences can be found there. It hosts an entirely unique brand of game developers that kind of don't have anywhere to go without it, and it is a huge loss to a lot of people. It's time to talk about today's sponsor, Raycon. I was actually genuinely very excited to talk about these today because of a new extremely accessibility friendly feature that I think could be potentially life-changing for some people. So Raycon's fan favorite. So let's look at the company who is responsible, Collective Shout. Collective Shout was founded in 2010 by Australian activist and journalist Melinda Tankard-Reist. She is a self-identified radical feminist, speaks at Christian events, and alleges to want to use Collective Shout to desexualize popular culture. The organization first gained popularity for trying to ban Tyler, the Creator, from touring Australia in 2013. I'm pretty sure I remember this happening. And then they tried to block Snoop Dogg and Eminem from touring for violent or misogynistic lyrics. I'm going to quote one of the removed articles here written by Anna Valens, who is one of the journalists I've used this video to pay for their work on this, being that the article was taken down by their parent company, Vice. It reads, in 2018, Collective Shout encouraged its supporters to sign a petition to ban Quantic Dream's Detroit Become Human from sale in Australia, claiming the game features child abuse and violence against women. The petition focused on an abusive father's violent behavior towards his housekeeper and daughter in the game. I actually interviewed a psychologist about this exact topic back when I was still a journalist, and their take regarding the suggestion that Detroit Become Human was somehow promoting violence against women was that almost the opposite was actually true. The suggestion was that video games are actually the ideal medium to tackle these kinds of themes, so long as they aren't glorifying them, which this game absolutely does not, because it kind of forces empathy on the player in ways that film and TV shows or whatever other passive mediums are totally unable to. I remember them saying that if someone who may have had violent tendencies were to play through an experience like this, there's a much higher chance that they may actually be critical of the aggressive character, causing internal reflection, than that they would be inspired by that character. Even bad people tend to see themselves as heroes after all, so there's something very unique about having someone play as the victim in a situation that they may be perpetuating in real life. So what an odd thing for Collective Shout, a apparently radical feminist organization, to campaign against. Unless you look at the bigger picture, this company does not actually care about the content of any of these video games. It is an evangelical crusade to take down video games that certainly failed with Detroit Become Human, because it is so easily defensible in the case of that game. So few people are willing to defend No Mercy. I get it. I actively dislike the content of this game, but because of that, they tried again. It's basically like an, okay, well, it didn't work with this game, but we still really want to take down video games. Let's have one that no one can easily argue against, use it as an in, then blow up the target being the games industry from the inside. And that's why this campaign from Collective Shout is so valuable to them and so easily effective. They picked a game, like I said, very few people are comfortable arguing in favor of, to use it as example, to then make it seem like a lot of games are doing this in order to push a religious agenda without actually caring about if it is or is not reflective of vast majority of games on the platform. It is a very effective censorship strategy and difficult to fight against. This is especially effective with the attack on itch.io, considering how disproportionately queer creators were affected. Basically, basically existing while being queer is considered sexual by this particular kind of religious activist, and thus any expression from that community gets lumped in with no mercy. It is all degenerate and thus must all be removed. Oh, what, you're defending these kind of games? What, you like No Mercy? What is wrong with you? See? It's that easy. If we've established that they cling onto one particular outlier of a thing to penetrate an entire market from a religious basis, let's talk about how they actually do that. I found a recent podcast, which doesn't even have 100 views at the time that I'm recording this, where Melinda spoke about the exact sort of playbook she used to start this particular campaign.
Tell us the story of your victory, because this is a story that has a lot of hope.
Yes. Well, Collective Shark for a World Free of Sexploitation is 15 years old. We're a grassroots campaigning movement. We're like a rapid response, hit squad. We move into action as fast as we possibly can, and we were alerted to this game. We looked into it and we thought, let's run a campaign, and it developed very, very quickly. So the first thing we did was on a Sunday. On a Sunday, my colleague Caitlin Roper put in a complaint to our training classification board about the game. On the Monday, we decided to launch the campaign anyway because we don't know when we would get the ruling, and we felt the game warranted a campaign kind of regardless of the Australian status. It's a global game. The internet has no borders. So we launched our campaign on Monday, and we encouraged our supporters to email the CEO of Valve, the parent company of Steam, and 3,000 of our supporters leapt into gear. We made it quite easy for them with a button that would send their emails directly.
By the way, I don't think I need to tell my audience this, as you are not the kind of people who would do this, but please do not go into the comments of this video and harass these women. I mean that both strategically and ethically. They're already using that against gamers because, of course, some fucking asshole losers in the games community started sending these women threats of their nature, I shouldn't say, proving that gamers are in some way like violent sexist creeps are only helping their case. Anyway, effectively they use what they call well-targeted campaigns that are specifically focused on petition signatures and volume of emails. They succeed by managing to infuriate people using something misleading or dishonest, then organizing them to flood whoever their target is in high quantities, which pretty standard internet playbook stuff. People on the internet have done this to me personally a whole bunch of times. It is a very common tactic to try to censor someone / something that you don't like. It's common because it works. Here is what they're planning to do going forward to attack itch.io and Steam, basically blatantly admitting that this is not over yet.
We support you. What action can we uplift through our networks? Are you doing petition, a letter? What can we activate?
Literally, this is just being discussed as we speak. So what we're looking at, probably not another petition. We don't want to give people petition fatigue. We've just had 2 massive ones in a row. We are going to go direct to PayPal, and I think we'll set up like an email system. We will go after them on our social media platforms. So feel free to share, to retweet, to own emails. You carry a lot of authority there at NCOSY. You carry a lot of weight, and your weight there, particularly in the US, would really help. So we're currently putting together the names of PayPal executives, and we're going to get their names out on every platform, on all of our platforms, and their faces, and tell people what PayPal is enabling and facilitating, one of the most egregious crimes, imaginable. Why would a legitimate, financial services processing corporate like PayPal want to be part of that?
And again, they still say all of this without listing a single game, but it kind of doesn't matter. They don't have to, because if they attack CEOs with enough numbers, they will assume there are tons of these games. It is knowingly disingenuous. They make the most sensational claims possible using the most inflammatory terms possible in order to scare these companies into enacting censorship, because they are, at the end of the day, companies who are risk averse in the interest of maintaining share value on, you guessed it, the stock market is the villain again. This particular strategy, an organization attacking a credit card company in order to censor the internet, is also certainly not new. This is not article from 2015 that discusses an already decade-long occurrence at that point of payment processors and platforms shutting down businesses that relate to sex work or sex in any capacity. Porn stars were having their bank accounts closed. Chase refused to process payments from condom company Lovability, telling CEO Tiffany Gaines that processing sales for adult-oriented products is a prohibited vertical. I'm going to leave a full link to the Engadget article in the description because it's genuinely super interesting, top to bottom. Also goes over the like bizarre cop-out phenomenon that these companies who are enacting this kind of censorship go through. Like back in 2014, when a company called WePay shut down a bunch of revenue sources for sex workers, their excuse was both acquiring banks and the card brands generally restrict the processing of payments for any activity that is deemed unlawful, high risk, or brand damaging to the networks. Which, okay, as an aside, who on earth gives a flying fuck about users' brand image? Do you know what I mean? Like, shut up. No one cares. Just let me access my own goddamn bank account. But when Patreon went through a similar thing years ago, banning NSFW content, they blamed PayPal. PayPal blamed the credit card companies. The credit card companies have a history of saying that they have nothing to do with it. Or they just sheepishly say we have to protect our brand. And that's all they've really said. Over 20 plus years of religious organizations trying to target porn or sex work or anything sexual in general. Now, for the record, I do think that games that feature the interactive sexual exploitation of children should be banned. Virtually everything that doesn't directly involve children or everything that is not illegal specifically, however, is a slippery slope that I am against. I think that a game like No Mercy is deeply disturbing and I hate it. I also think that it has right to exist. In no small part because censorship does not stop at the things that you personally do not like. I'm not a consumer of porn games, but I should be allowed to be if I want to be because I decide what I spend my goddamn money on, not some hardcore religious organization. And even if I never want to be, I will not allow Collective Shout to take down games because this is the same goddamn organization that also tried to take down GTA 5 and will definitely have a campaign against GTA 6, which I personally would really like to play, okay? And I don't know if it's just me grinding hands off of GTA 6. If I have to defend games that I find reprehensible to protect games I love, then yes, I'm going to do that, even if it makes me uncomfortable. Shit that makes me uncomfortable is allowed to exist. A payment processor should not have the ability to censor video games or any media, especially considering how dependent we are on them. This is, in my opinion, a massive ongoing problem that someone has to find a solution to. Like, it is just such an easily exploitable loophole that obviously religious activist groups have used many times before and will continue to use. There needs to be some kind of legislation making this much more firmly illegal somehow. The problem is it's just really difficult to do that because private companies can operate how they please. So, the first, most passive thing that you can actually do about this is stand up for free speech. I know it sounds really cheesy, but I mean it. Actively, vocally stand up for how important it is that porn games be allowed to exist even if you don't like or play them. We've made it so taboo to even address this facet of gaming, but the reality is that it is important. They say new technology lives or dies by the porn industry. VHS took off as soon as porn was available on it. The same applied on the internet. Video games are a little different, but not as different as you might think. It is a facet of the games industry that must be allowed to exist. And I'm not just saying that because I personally actually really like sexy video game characters, even though I do. But if we look back at the censorship video game characters, even though I do. But if we look back at the censorship of popular blog site Tumblr, which was previously significantly fueled by sex-related content creation, then somewhat suddenly restricted it from search results and banned it entirely, that failure becomes pretty obvious. Tumblr's traffic dropped by 30% and it has never fully recovered. The company dramatically devalued in the years following. Yahoo originally bought Tumblr for over $1 billion, then sold it in 2019 for less than $3 million. It's a great example of a blanket ban directly crushing an entire subculture that the brand underestimates the importance of, both revenue-wise and community-wise. There was also an attempted ban on sexual content on OnlyFans, which is like genuinely hilarious to even think about, but that very quickly failed. Back in 2021, OnlyFans said they were going to ban sexually explicit content from the platform, but reversed their decision almost immediately when users at large said they were going to migrate to other platforms, and some actually started to do it. OnlyFans leadership said that they were able to reverse the decision by striking a deal with the banks. They were only ever pushed to even have those conversations when they realized that their brand was damn fragile, almost useless without sexual content creators. My simple passive thesis for point one is this: we support sex games. Even outside of like obvious principle of I support developers making what they want to make, they are a legitimate pillar of virtually every form of media. People write them off as Guna games or whatever. They get that it's uncomfortable to talk about it and it makes people feel awkward, but they are in fact a part of the games industry. They do in fact contribute to the health of the games industry and its various platforms and are largely made by indie teams who continue producing more and more and more and more of that content that people consume. The second thing is what a lot of people are already doing and is ultimately the only feasible option right now, which is yell louder than these activist groups are yelling. Someone has already set up a change.org petition. I will leave a link in the description below to where you can check that out. It is called Tell MasterCard, Visa, and activist groups stop controlling what we can watch, read, or play. It says, we demand that MasterCard, Visa, and their pressure partners stop censoring legal, fictional content that complies with the law and platform standards. Reject influence from activist groups that promote moral panic or misrepresent fiction as harm. Be fully transparent about content restrictions and the rationale behind them. Protect creators' rights to make legal adult content and ensure a fair appeals process for any penalized media. I can get behind all of that. Please go sign it. Otherwise, numerous game developers have already started campaigns to just directly contact the financial companies, and I am here for it. There are a couple of websites specifically set up to give direct advice on how you can help. Stop-PayPros on NeoCities is one of those. Again, I'll leave a link in the description. They list petitions you can sign, people you can contact, and even include things to actually say. Loads of devs have been sharing their experiences of calling Visa and MasterCard about video game censorship. I'll leave a link to where you can find numbers for Visa, MasterCard, Stripe, and PayPal if you would like to contact them and either make a complaint about this issue. Basically, you can tell them that you would like to be able to purchase adult content if you so choose, and that this has been taken away from you on some websites you frequent, and you would like to know why. Or you can just ask why. I would also suggest that we contact the CEOs of these companies directly, as shown in the previous clip. That is what Collective Shout is planning to do. I am obviously not encouraging harassment. Do not harass anybody. I do not think this is a good idea in any capacity, but I do think airing your concerns regarding corporate censorship directly is a completely fair and reasonable thing to do. Conveniently, Collective Shout already told us all of their names. Alex Chris, the CEO of PayPal, is on Twitter at ACCE. I'll leave a link in the description to all of these. You can find Michael Maybach, CEO of MasterCard, at MaybachMichael. Ryan McClernimney, CEO of Visa, is most easily found on LinkedIn, as are Bruce Leathers of PaySafe Limited and Michael J. Shepard of Discover. Again, not encouraging harassment, but I am encouraging you to use your voice to speak up against corporate censorship and to be loud and very polite about it. Religious activists should not be allowed to dictate what other people on a fucking global scale get to spend their money on. If you don't want to play certain games, Collective Shout, that's totally cool. Don't fucking play that.
That one was a roller coaster. Tomorrow, Jufufu, and not only Jufufu, lots of stuff is left until tomorrow. How history works, does inequality only ever get worse? The 2 times it got better was because the largest cohort was armed and the elites knew it was vital to the world to spread the success around. I guess I don't need to watch this video anymore.
You've probably already heard these statistics. 8 people control more wealth than the poorest half of humanity combined. In advanced countries, wage gains for the top 1% have almost trebled over the same time as the bottom 90% struggled to keep up with inflation. And even the poor old megacorporations are feeling the squeeze. Yeah, that's right, the record-breaking stock market that has driven a lot of this inequality is itself more unequal than it has ever been before. The 20 most valuable companies in America are now worth more than every other public company combined, and it gets worse internationally. Just Nvidia alone is worth more than every single public company listed here in the UK, and we are the 2nd largest financial market in the world. Now, I know all of this probably isn't a huge shock to you anymore. and that's exactly the point. It seems like no matter which way you look, inequality is only getting worse. And for as long as we can remember, it's only ever been getting worse. But it can't go on forever, right? Well, history might beg to differ. The Roman Empire, the modern global economy, the Soviet Union, colonial Europe, capitalism, feudalism, socialism, tribalism, it might not really matter. Throughout the ages, there have always been the elites and everybody else. The only thing that changes is what everybody else gets in return for going along with it. They get to keep their jobs, their homes, their heads, take your pick. But the nature of inequality hasn't changed, only its trade-offs. To fix the problem, we need to understand the problem, or else we are bound to make the mistakes of the past. Even simple little ideas like family wealth on average disappears within 3 generations is mostly just simply wrong. But these all too common misunderstandings still shape our belief of dynastic wealth in the modern day. Maybe deep down we assume that eventually the guillotine will come back into style again as we reach some kind of breaking point. But almost every time we have tried that, it's only made things worse. Well, except for that one time.
The global economy is broken, Oxfam says in a new report which finds 8 billionaires own as much wealth as the poorest half of the world's population.
Most Europeans at the time were subjects of Rome. There's an immensely rich, powerful, very small ruling class and a very high degree of inequality.
In Stalin's Russia, so many members of the old bourgeoisie were hounded, persecuted. They could lose their lives just for being quote-unquote bourgeoisie in the Marxist.
Inequality is incredibly difficult for historians to study for 3 simple reasons. The first is that it's really hard to compare levels of wealth over different time periods. Someone like Augustus might have personally owned all of Egypt as his personal property, but even still, most of you wouldn't trade your modern life with him because of the conveniences and comforts you would be foregoing. And I just gotta say, I am so proud of you guys. Part of being a good student of history is appreciating how much most of history sucked. The second problem is that levels of wealth are really hard to compare within our own time period. Modern wealth is normally measured using net worth. You take the value of everything you own and subtract the value of everything you owe. Simple enough, but it can, frankly, lead to some pretty dumb results when addressing inequality. To use a personal anecdote, fresh out of my postgrad, which I wisely decided to do in a different country, I had a net worth of about negative $80,000. Fortunately, Big Daddy How Money Works looked after us, so it's not a problem now.
I guess those are sister channels.
Now, but at the time, that technically made me one of the poorest people in history, since medieval serfs couldn't exactly take out student loans. This has raised the argument that maybe the reason inequality under capitalism looks so bad is because, at least partially, it's just a lot easier to measure inequality when everybody keeps a detailed inventory of their personal property. So what we really need is a better way of measuring wealth across very different populations and very different time periods that doesn't resort to crude adjustments for inflation. Now stick with me here, but the best way to do that might be to look at how much energy different people consume over their lifetimes. Energy usage is almost perfectly correlated with consumption in the modern world and throughout recorded history, meaning a unit of energy is almost a perfect stand-in for a unit of consumption. Heating, cooling, communications, transportation, it all takes energy, and so does manufacturing stuff. To collect resources, turn them into something useful, and then ship it around the world, it's all energy. If we can use a unit of energy like a joule as the basis of comparison, it solves a lot of problems when it comes to measuring inequality. The first is how it deals with debt. Having more debt than assets might technically give you negative net worth, but that doesn't mean you are really worse off than somebody that truly has nothing. What this method simplifies is what debt actually does. It just moves around the time you get to use your resources. And again, consuming resources is highly correlated with consuming energy. If, for example, you take out a loan to buy a house, you get access to a lot of resources right up front. But as you lose part of your income to paying off that debt over the following years, you will need to consume less than you could have without making those repayments. The second problem this method solves is the true value of wealth. Sure, Elon Musk might be worth $450 billion on paper, but as many people will point out, if he actually sells all of his assets, which are mostly stocks in various hyped-up companies, their market value would tank, meaning he would only realize a fraction of that value in cold hard cash. To make matters worse, if he tried to spend all of that cash acquiring other resources like land, gold, elections, or other companies, their value would spike. But by just looking at the resources he could gain access to over his lifetime thanks to his paper wealth, it accounts for these financial realities automatically. The third advantage, most crucially for a video about history, is that by comparing energy usage, we don't need to crudely try and work out a foreign exchange adjustment between ancient Rome and the modern world. Baking a loaf of bread uses roughly as much energy now as it did back then. Okay then, so how much energy did the ancient Roman Empire use? Well, the good news is, far smarter people than me have already figured that out for us. The bad news is, it involves a little bit of maths. Paolo Melanima is an economic historian who wrote a paper that worked this problem backwards. He knew that as a baseline, humans needed between 2 to 5 gigajoules of energy every year to survive and do the labor-intensive work they were doing. This translates to around 1,300 to 2,600 calories per day, which is not a lot, especially for people toiling fields, but that was the reality. One thing you need to remember is that for most of human history, almost the entire economy of even the most advanced empires was dedicated to growing enough food to keep people alive. And after that was done, there wasn't much time or energy left for much else. This is also the reason why land originally had value. It was a way to harvest energy. Back then, they didn't have solar arrays or wind turbines that needed wide open fields, but they could use crops or pastures to do effectively the same thing. Crops collected energy from the sun and turned it into energy that could be consumed by people. Over time, the economic use of land as a speculative asset has changed, and believe me, we gotta talk about that. But this is how it all started. The more land an empire had, the more people it could feed, the bigger army it could assemble, and the more land it could conquer. Of course, food wasn't the empire's only source of usable energy. Livestock was also used as mechanical power to haul carts and plough fields. Meat was a luxury for most people because it was a very inefficient source of calories, so most animal food was turned into animal work. Melanima calculated this to work out to 2 to 5 gigajoules per person as well. The animals needed more food than the average human, but there were fewer of them to feed. The final source of energy was firewood. It varied by region, but the average Roman burned between 4 to 9 gigajoules of firewood every year for warmth, cooking, metalworking, and, of course, it was Rome, so bathing as well. One of the limitations that held back economic expansion was that the cities didn't have enough fuel to burn, and the empire often struggled with widespread deforestation. Added up, the average Roman was consuming between 8 and 19 gigajoules of energy a year between food, fuel, and the work of their animals. That is about the same as some of the poorest third world countries today, which makes sense since much of sub-Saharan Africa, for example, still relies primarily on basic fuel sources and livestock. By comparison, the average American uses about 275 gigajoules of primary energy every year, which doesn't include energy from food. Now, the average American is clearly eating more calories than the average Roman, but not enough to really make a huge difference at this scale anyway. And you know the average American doesn't want to talk about a scale, am I right? What makes this method really interesting is that the comparable GDP per capita lines up almost perfectly with other estimates from people like Walter Schiedel and Stephen Friesen in their research published in the Journal of Roman Studies. They used a different technique based on the value of wheat, but still arrived at basically the same economic figures. So then, we have worked out what the average person's resource consumption was, but what about the people at the very top? According to various publications, Emperor Augustus had a household staff of between 500 to 2,000 people to handle cooking, cleaning, entertainment, and administration of the staff themselves. Some of these were slaves, and some positions in service to the royal household were highly coveted. And on top of this, we need to include into our calculations that only the hours they spent working should be counted towards the emperor's personal consumption. This also doesn't include his Praetorian Guard, which were primarily responsible for his personal protection and could be counted towards his own personal resource usage as well. What's more is that by most accounts, Augustus, despite being arguably the wealthiest Roman emperor on paper, actually lived pretty modestly. Some of his successors, like Nero, would develop far more lavish palaces and household staff taking from the public treasury to fund their own personal consumption. Just by these historical accounts, the emperor at the time would consume about 500 to 2,000 times more resources than the average Roman, primarily to feed the people who personally served them, heat, light, and construct much larger dwellings, and fill them with fine, crafted wares from artisans across the empire. So how does that compare to a modern billionaire? Well, Elon Musk has the largest net worth on paper of anybody in the world currently, but in terms of the actual resources that he has claimed for himself, meaning they can't be used by anybody else, by far his biggest splurge is private air travel. Musk's 2 Gulfstream jets were tracked logging a total of 881 hours in the air in 2024, according to public flight data. Ignoring the depreciation on the highly technical aircraft and concentrating exclusively on the fuel, that would equate to a total energy consumption of 62,000 gigajoules, or about 2,500 times more than the average American, or 7,000 times more than the average global citizen. And that's just the fuel. If we include the resources that are spent manufacturing an item that will eventually need to be scrapped, spare parts, staff, ground crew, then the actual consumption could easily be double that. Musk uses his jet a lot, but there are also thousands of these aircrafts across the world serving thousands of billionaires. And don't get me started on how many resources go into keeping super yachts afloat. So when compared to a handful of monarchs spread across the ancient world, it's very clear that the world is spending far more of its resources on a small group of elites today than it has at any point in history. But is that actually a problem? Sure, these guys are using far more resources than any other humans in history, but there are also far more resources to go around, right? Well, it's time to learn how history works, to find out why inequality only ever gets worse. Today's episode is sponsored by Brilliant. Brilliant is a powerful learning platform built around the idea that the best way to understand something. Now, the third problem that comes with tracing the history of inequality is politics. Yeah, I know, disgusting. But throughout modern history, in nations where the people have a say, there have always been 2 opposing views. One side argues that inequality is necessary to guide the free market, spur individual initiative, motivate innovation, and encourage calculated risk-taking, so that society as a whole can flourish based on rational self-interest. If you invent the steam engine, you should get rich, which is great for you, but it also means that society will benefit from heavy industry and mass transportation, which is also good for everybody. The opposing view is that inequality actually stifles those very same principles. People can't make big contributions to society if they never receive an education or get access to basic tools and are instead focused exclusively on putting a roof over their head and food on their table. Now, the annoying thing is that both sides of this argument are technically correct in their own way. However, modern politics has made it so that rational compromise between these points is incredibly difficult to find. Capitalism is either the root of all evil, destined to destroy itself, or it's the very reason why America is great, Britain is just okay, and Europe is terrible. here is a question for you. What is capitalism? If you are brave enough, you can leave your answer in the comments below. But historically, it's a system that has involved a lot of compromise and careful planning. Even Adam Smith, the grandfather of capitalism, said as much extensively in his writing. He believed that kings and lords just living off their land wasn't getting society anywhere, so the world needed a new system. He believed the most effective way to maximize the wealth of nations was to let people specialize in what they were best at and then trade with other people who would also specialize in what they were best at, so that the people could be rewarded for doing one thing really well. As long as there was a free and fair market system to facilitate trade, people could be confident that they would have access to everything they needed to survive, even if they dedicated their entire working week to just making tools, while someone else focused on farming. However, Smith was adamant that those markets needed to be free and fair. If they weren't, then people would just corner vital resources and charge more than the value they were providing, with a tactic that would later go on to be called rent-seeking. If this happened too much, then this new system of capitalism would just repeat all of the same problems that came from lazy lords living off their land, never wanting to change anything. If you actually read his work, the grandfather of capitalism said a lot of things that would probably get him called a radical socialist in your average YouTube comment section. And that's because the definition of what capitalism is has kind of been lost to time. Free markets, free trade, and free enterprise don't belong to capitalism, and neither does inequality. The original idea of capitalism was honestly far more boring and technical than you think. It was simply that people could own capital and be rewarded for that ownership. For this purpose, when early economists like John Locke, Adam Smith, David Ricardo, and even Karl Marx spoke about capital, they meant revenue-generating assets with the exception of land. Cash, machinery, tools, fuel, and even intellectual property are all categorized as capital. And what capitalism is supposed to do is enable the private ownership of this stuff with the expectations that its owners will want to improve their tools and therefore maximize output for themselves and society. For example, a lord on a farm with 19th century technology could only do so much to improve crop yields. But a factory owner adopts new technologies, fine-tunes production lines, and mandates more overtime from their child labourers. These improvements drove the Industrial Revolution and created a new class of elites, the capitalists. Though, to be fair, a lot of these early capitalists were also nobility, since they were more often than not the only ones with the resources to invest into industry. But a rising tide lifts all boats. The only reason why someone like Elon Musk can use more energy than the entire Roman Empire in a year, shuttling himself and his entourage around the world on a private jet, is because the world invented jets, which meant it also invented air travel, and refined hydrocarbons and high-tech manufacturing and radio communications. All of these capital technologies have enabled the wealthiest people in the world to pull even further ahead of everybody else. No matter how many of Rome's resources an emperor claimed, he was never going to be able to build a Gulf Stream.
Thank you.
But improving capital has also helped you and I live far more comfortable lives, even if we are further behind today's elites. Throughout most of history, land was the decider of wealth, and that wealth was limited because, well, we can't make more land. Well, I mean, unless you count those silly islands in Dubai. Either way, today, the landed aristocracy has given way to the capitalists who source their wealth from other assets that, in theory, make us all wealthier. But that shift hasn't come without its own trade-offs. When the wealth of an empire's elite was literally tied to the physical land of the empire itself, it meant that they had some obligation to the system that elevated them in the first place. Land is scarce. Land is also immobile. But an increasing share of modern capital is just digits on a screen that can literally be transported anywhere. This has made inequality much harder to control because today's global elites don't need to manage their own empires. They can just move to whatever nation will give them and their capital the best home. So the real question is, how far does inequality have to go before it no longer encourages these kinds of improvements and instead starts squashing them? Well, the important thing to remember is that for most of history, this debate didn't really matter. Before representative democracies, rulers didn't need to sell the idea of inequality so long as they had a greater military force than those who would challenge them. They could legitimize the inequality by calling it a divine right to rule and offering protection to their subjects. But it really did come down to whoever had the biggest stick. Unsurprisingly, when their place in the hierarchy of humanity was secured, the drive to innovate was not nearly as strong. This changed in the Age of Enlightenment, when great thinkers started questioning the long-held status quo of humanity. Questions like, who says the king's son gets the rule? What if all men are created equal? Why don't we let markets decide? What happens if we put them in the guillotines instead? All fair questions. And it opened up some of the most important variables in the study of inequality: social mobility. Social mobility is the ability for people at the bottom of the wealth spectrum to rise to the top if they work hard, improve their skills, invest carefully, make contributions that are valued by a market system, or just get really lucky. Now, you can say a lot about inequality in the modern world, but social mobility has undoubtedly improved since ancient times, where your position in society was decided by your birthrights. If you were born a peasant, you were almost guaranteed to die a peasant. Today, there are no such guarantees. It's probably not going to happen to you, but you could build a business or land a job that propels you into the global 1%, where even just 200 years ago, that was a closed club. But that's been an anomaly rather than the expectation. The other side of the social mobility coin is that the wealthiest people also need to be able to lose their spot at the top if they get complacent, misuse their capital, or are just generally wasteful. There is an old anecdote that I'm sure you have probably heard about families going from rags to rags within 3 generations. The first generation makes a fortune, the second generation grows the fortune, and the third generation squanders the fortune. It makes sense since you don't see families like the Rockefellers, the Vanderbilts, or the Carnegies anymore, but it's actually based on absolutely no real data whatsoever. At best, this idea traces its origins back to a small, informal, and misquoted study from the 1980s, which found that family businesses typically only last 3 generations. But businesses and fortunes are not always the same thing. And besides, the 1980s were a very opportune time to run such a study in the first place. Several wealthy families across Europe can trace their lineage back centuries across dozens of generations. A study in Florence, Italy, for example, found that families who were wealthy in the city 600 years ago were still the wealthiest family in the city today. Literally, as I was writing this video, details of a juicy story dropped about one of the heirs to the Hermes family fortune, who had lost almost his entire $15 billion fortune, allegedly, to a financial advisor who was embezzling his money. He was a 5th generation descendant of Thierry Hermes, who first started the luxury goods company 188 years ago. By all accounts, the heir had not worked a day in his life since leaving school in the 1960s and took no interest in even managing his own money, which is partially why he allegedly didn't realize it was slowly going missing. Now, of course, this particular line of family wealth has now ended. But if he hadn't made such a careless mistake, there is no reason why $15 billion couldn't have lasted for several more lifetimes. For our purposes, if that isn't the perfect example of a useless Nepo baby having access to resources they don't know how to effectively manage, then I don't know what is. Across the world, where we have reliable historic data, family wealth on average lasts far longer than 3 generations for 2 different reasons. Back in the age of hereditary estates, fortunes would pass from one heir to the next, keeping most of the fortune intact until some outside force, like a war or a revolution, put an end to it. In fact, one of the conditions that was implemented after the French Revolution was strict inheritance laws, which forced equal division of estates between children rather than the tradition of the entire estate going to a single heir. This slowly dispersed wealth over time, instead of keeping it concentrated in a single lineage. France became the exception that proved the rule. In today's age, family wealth passing to a single heir is not illegal, but it has fallen out of fashion. The only difference is now, family fortunes can grow faster than families can. Sam Walton, the founder of Walmart, was once the richest man on earth. In 1985, he was worth $23 billion. Adjusted for inflation, that would be $64 billion today. An impressive fortune, don't get me wrong, but significantly less than his 4 children, who are now worth more than $120 billion each. They have also diversified outside of owning the world's largest retailer. So even if Walmart ceased to exist tomorrow, they would still be some of the richest people on earth, easily outlasting the family business. This applies to lesser multimillionaires and billionaires as well. If market returns are greater than economic growth, then the people who own the market are always going to stay ahead of those working in the economy. For the last 100 years in a country like America, market returns have averaged just under 10% per annum, where economic growth has been around 4%. In places like Europe, the gap is even wider. We never used to split up family fortunes, and now we simply can't split them up fast enough. Either way, the old adage about wealth coming and going within 3 generations just doesn't hold up in reality. So then what happened to the family fortunes of the Rockefellers or the Vanderbilts? Why aren't they still around today? Well, there are actually 2 reasons for this. The first is that, believe it or not, they are still around today. Almost 100 years after John D. died, his great-grandson, David Jr., is still a multi-billionaire. The fortune has been split up over hundreds of heirs, but market returns have generally outpaced family growth. Their fortunes have also become so diversified and secretive that outlets like Bloomberg, Forbes, or Fortune magazine can't accurately keep track of how much they are worth like they could with someone like Jeff Bezos, who owes most of his wealth to a single, easily trackable public stock. However, they are certainly a lot less wealthy than the families that came after them, like the Waltons, despite having more time to compound their wealth. The real reason that these families got wiped out was inheritance taxes and trust busting. Between 1940 and 1970, America had some of the highest interest taxes in the world. For large fortunes, the government would take as much as 77% of the estate before it was passed down to children, and there were very few ways to get around it. Family fortunes between these times couldn't just count on market returns alone, which meant families either had to take more risks with their capital or accept that they wouldn't stay wealthy in perpetuity just because they happened to inherit a lot of income-producing assets. The aftermath of the Second World War was one of the few times in history where inequality fell. In Europe, this was because a lot of the capital that made wealthy families wealthy was destroyed or used up in the war effort. Now, fixing inequality by literally leveling the playing field and making everybody start from scratch probably isn't going to be an easy sell at the best of times. But it didn't even really work long term. The elite families were made poorer, but they still had a larger share of the pie, and they were able to concentrate their wealth as Europe rebuilt. Today, a majority of European billionaires inherited their wealth, and in a country like Germany, family lineages often have to contend with some questionable previous business decisions. But in America, there was no such destruction. Inequality fell because of deliberate policies to crack down on big businesses that had caused problems like the Great Depression, and policies to support young people returning from the war. Taxes on inheritances and large incomes were high, but support for average workers was strong. Wealthy people in these years were also innovating because R&D was more tax efficient than playing financial games with stock buybacks. But this all slowly changed back just a few years later. A few small decisions had an impact so big we can literally see it across dozens of historic macroeconomic data points. So what the fuck happened in 1971? Go and watch this video next to find out why we unsolved inequality. And don't forget to like and subscribe to keep on learning how history works.
What the fuck happened in one? Literally. Video called What the fuck happened in 1971.
Many insects have a compulsion to follow the light. And you light it up!
Bring it! Huh? I'm going in! Fulfill our pact! Suffer the wrath of the...
Wrath from the skies!
Off we go! Let's light it up! Everybody, get to work! See Laline, East Papa, get him!
Light of the blazing sun!
Okay, that works.
Let's get down to business.
Strike a pose! Obey! Do your master's bidding! Merciless! Another star goes out! Shower me with praise! Let the world come alive! Goose on the loose! Transfiguration by ordinance divine. Mine to wield. Strike a pose. Time to shine. A little amuse-bouche. The pinnacle of excellence. Do your master's bidding.
Looking at economic data can sometimes be a bit bleak. Over the last 5 decades, wages have been left behind by economic productivity. Houses have gone from an essential good to a coveted investment. We are saving less money than ever before. Prices for everyday goods have outpaced earnings. The financial industry has become the largest sector in the economy. Debt around the world has spiked to unsustainable levels, and inequality has broken new records. For the first time since the Gilded Age, the top 0.1% in America controls more wealth than the bottom 90% combined. Elon Musk alone recently became the richest person in history, topping even the generous inflation-adjusted estimates of John D. Rockefeller in his prime. Although, to be fair, John D's prime lasted a lot longer than Musk's did. Anyway, all of this data tells a concerning story of a world that is heading in a bad direction. A direction that we have seen end in catastrophe many times throughout history before. But if you have keen eyes, or you just read the title of this video, you might have noticed that all of these alarming indicators took a bad turn at around the same time. So what the f happened in 1971?
I directed Secretary Connally to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets.
The speed with which we are watching this market deteriorate now at the same time has fallen about 18%.
Soaring gas prices, falling home prices, and rising unemployment.
You have to kind of keep yourself out of harm's way and pick spots, and if that spot's not working, you have to move on and wait for another spot.
The stock market is now down 21%.
Take your true form by ordinance divine.
On August 15th, 1971, then President Richard Nixon temporarily suspended the convertibility of American currency into gold, effectively putting the final nail in the coffin of the gold standard. Nixon never actually got around to reversing that temporary suspension. I guess something must have happened to him.
Well, I'm not a crook. I've earned everything I've got.
So yeah, this announcement in particular gets a lot of attention as the turning point in modern economic history. The dividing line between the golden age of capitalism. Before this, everybody got a house in the suburbs, a Ford Cortina and a stay-at-home wife. And afterwards, everything got worse year after year until today, where you will own nothing and be happy. It's a compelling message that aligns neatly with the idea that money is no longer real, since there is nothing physical backing it up. But there is a little bit more to it than that. For a majority of you watching from America, you should know that you actually have more of a right to own gold as a store of value today than you did back before 1971. More importantly, a lot of stuff changed in the 1970s, and focusing exclusively on the gold standard means that we would miss a lot of stuff that a few people would probably prefer to have kept swept under the rug. Finally, there is the simple burning question that must be answered. If dropping the gold standard messed up so many things, why did we do it? And why can't we just go back? Well, the reason why America got rid of gold convertibility in the first place is an initiative I can get behind wholeheartedly: sticking it to the French. After the Second World War, a bunch of major countries got together with the goal of making global trade and cooperation easier. The idea was that if countries were dependent on one another for finance and commerce, they would be less likely to go to war again. This conference, held in the Mount Washington Hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, was like the Woodstock for economists. Anybody who was anybody was there, and it really did change global history. In just 3 weeks, officials from 44 individual countries and some of the world's top economists hammered out the creation of the International Monetary Fund, the predecessor to the World Bank and World Trade Organization, and also decided that GDP would become the benchmark for measuring countries' economies. It's impressive stuff, since they also reportedly managed to squeeze in a few hundred rounds of golf, but even all of that wasn't actually the big news. The namesake agreement of this economic powwow was a plan to set the exchange rates of participating countries' currencies to the American dollar, and then the American dollar itself would be set to a specific amount of physical gold. It was a good deal, but I should make it clear that only other central banks were allowed to make this trade. American citizens weren't allowed to own gold as a store of value at all. The American Fed at the time was pretty flush with gold, since 11 years earlier, in 1933, they demanded that their own people hand over almost all the gold they owned in exchange for set compensation. There were minor exemptions made for things like personal jewelry, but Uncle Sam was the only player allowed to hold investment quantities of the stuff. This big stockpile of gold meant that other reserve banks could be pretty confident that they would always be able to change over their American dollars for gold if the need ever arose. To call it a real gold standard was a bit of a stretch, since only a few institutions around the world were allowed to trade the gold back and forth with one another. It was really more of an accounting system. But it was a system that did assist with global trade. Alongside the advent of the standardized shipping container, it made global commerce easier than ever before, because people could now do business between currencies without having to worry about how much they were really worth. Today, that might not sound like a big deal because we can get instantly updated foreign exchange rates on our phone, but before this, it was a big deal. Imagine trying to settle a simple transaction between your friends using airline miles as the medium of exchange. How much is a British Airway point worth compared to a Chris Flyer mile? There are comparison tools, but it's all needlessly complicated. Back in the 1930s, doing business internationally really was this complicated. The Bretton Woods system removed that problem entirely, and global trade boomed. However, over time it became clear that the Americans were getting a slightly better deal than everyone else. In theory, their currency was convertible for physical gold. But since other central banks rarely exercised this right, the Americans could spend a few pennies printing a piece of paper that every other country would have to give them $100 worth of stuff for in exchange. The president of France at the time, Charles de Gaulle, whose name was given to the world's worst airport in the history of humanity until Stansted in London, called this the extraordinary privilege, and he effectively tried to call America on its bluff by actually taking their stockpile of American dollars and converting them back into gold. His successor, President Pompidou, would eventually sail a battleship into New York Harbor to collect the gold owed to them. By this time, there were far more dollars in circulation than the US Fed had the reserves to convert back into gold. Over a decade, they burned through about half of their total reserves before Nixon called it off in his infamous address. Today, even if America wanted to go back onto this compromised version of a gold standard, it doesn't have nearly as much gold as it did back when the global economy was much smaller. And other countries almost certainly wouldn't agree to it anyway, especially not right now. After the Second World War, the USA had extraordinary negotiating power, and it helped to rebuild the economies of Europe and Japan. Today, not so much. So it's time to learn how history works, to find out how abandoning what really amounted to little more than an accounting system did so much damage. This video is brought to you by Storyworth, a service that helps preserve your family's most meaningful memories in a beautiful, professionally bound keepsake book. Storyworth makes it simple to capture the life stories of someone special, like a parent or grandparent, by sending them thoughtful questions each week. As they respond over the course of a year, their answers, along with any photos, are compiled into a hardcover book your family can cherish for generations. I got Storyworth for my mum, and it's been amazing hearing stories I'd never heard before. Memories from her childhood, life lessons, even funny family moments that were totally new to me. I get to pick the questions she receives each week. There are hundreds to choose from, like how did you get to school every day, or where were you during the moon landing. I even wrote a few of my own to make sure we captured certain stories. It's been such a meaningful way to connect. One of the best features? She can write her answers or record them by phone, whichever's easiest. And immediately following the suspension of gold convertibility, the price of gold relative to the dollar shot up by almost 1,000%. It did this for two reasons. The first reason was that people realized that their dollar reserves no longer worked as pseudo-gold reserves, so they rushed to rebalance their books. The second reason is that investors are naturally attracted to gold as a safe investment during uncertain times. Like the president resetting the global order of trade and finance? It's up to you which time in particular I am talking about, but in both instances, the price of gold rose dramatically. Now, some economists point to this as proof that money started losing its value the second it wasn't backed by something that couldn't be endlessly printed. Other economists argue that it was actually the Bretton Woods system that was distorting the free market. Gold was locked away and prescribed an arbitrary value as a trinket of exchange rather than being allowed to be priced accurately through the forces of supply and demand. Inflation did still exist between 1944 and 1971. In fact, it was actually one of the reasons why other countries realized that they were better off holding gold than USD. And it was also one of the reasons why Nixon decided to stop convertibility. So the idea that while the price of gold didn't really change for almost 30 years, this was proof to many that it simply was not being priced correctly. Initially, the American markets and the American people liked Nixon's move. The day after the announcement, the market rallied, but there were problems on the horizon. The price of oil rose sharply on the announcement because the oil states were less willing to sell their valuable energy source in exchange for paper backed by nothing. Unlike gold, oil wasn't something that was being buried in a vault somewhere. It was being consumed every day to power the world's industries. The price jump was felt by regular people across the globe, not just at the fuel pump, but in every good or service that was powered by fossil fuels, which was basically all of them. What's made things worse is that 3 years later, the law that banned the private ownership of gold in America was repealed, and investors bought back in, driving up the price to all-time highs. In a trend that was probably a shock to nobody, the rate of new money being printed in the US also roughly accelerated. The money supply roughly doubled between 1960 and 1970, but it trebled between 1970 and 1980. Now, more cash flowing around the economy could give more opportunities to small businesses or young workers looking to get a job. Money is ultimately just a tool to facilitate trade, and the more money there is circulating, the easier it is for people to make purchases or investments. As long as things don't go too far, most economists actually acknowledge that a little bit of inflation can actually help regular people, because it ensures that the super wealthy don't just stockpile cash to hold onto value. Of course, the super wealthy have still become very good at hoarding wealth, but to make sure their fortunes grow faster than inflation, they do need to reinvest it into a portfolio of assets that should, at least in theory, benefit the entire economy. So then, if dropping the convertibility of gold wasn't to blame for everything wrong with our modern economy, what else changed in the 1970s? Well, something that you should look at in addition to all these scary charts is that gross domestic product also took off in the 1970s. And it did this for two reasons. Global trade continued to increase despite Bretton Woods falling apart and new technologies compounding to give us some of the most valuable modern businesses in history. With new global markets and finance being done around the world, a lot of fortunes were made.
Alright, looks like this is going to be it for this stream. Good luck, have fun, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.